Rosie Rosen. Today we're going to be talking about Real Speculations by Cadell Last, Thought Foundations, Drive Myths, Social Analysis. And I consider this book the paradigm upon which we need to think today. It is getting at the heart of matters that if we don't get at it, it's questionable if we're getting at anything at all. And I think he is exactly right that we tend to speak on speculations. We have a certain derogatory term he opens up with. Just speculations in relation to material reality. And this has crippled us from being able to think what we need to think, because fundamentally, where thought, where we as subjects also need to dwell in the patience of the concept, is going to be in a speculative reason. It is not going to be in a reason that is given to us by utility, pragmatism, capital, straightforward logic. It's going to be from a certain posture of a certain dwelling of the subject. Because we have to experience our thought. Our thought has to strike us. It has to be felt. It has to be embodied. It has to follow from a surprise of otherness that if we predicted ahead of time would not be a surprise at all, and in a sense wouldn't really be other. There's something about real speculation that requires thinking in a place of dwelling where the Lacanian real can break forth. We have to be at risk if we're to think. If we're not at risk of our thoughts. If our thoughts are not a risk to us, our thoughts are not going to be the thoughts our current moment needs. Section 1, Cadell breaks it down. He talks about, you'll see kind of in Section 1, Hegelian philosophy. Then there'll be a move more into Nietzsche for Section 2, and then the psychoanalytical work of Lacan in Section 3. We can associate Hegel with foundations. We can associate Nietzsche with existential as well. Where there is excess, there is something existential, because that which is in excess to us is that of which can convict us in being in excess as such, and it also calls our lives into question, that this excess so exceeds us, and then the psychoanalytical can follow from how we relate to that, because where there is excess, there is lack in us of that excess. And this can be difficult to live with and cope. Cadell has founded Philosophy Portal, which is invaluable for thinking our current moment. And we can see this book as reflecting the work that has been done in Philosophy Portal that, again, we have to take very, very seriously. And he writes, from the existentialist excess itself, we must reprocess theopolitical lack in order to build something that can withstand a world in the midst of a social apocalypse. And I'm quite fond of the phrase social apocalypse, because I do think we're in a social apocalypse. That's a phrase that I resonate with strongly, given the work of Belonging Again. And the book will ultimately lead to reflections on Christian atheism, which was a recent class that Cadell Last taught at Philosophy Portal. And I think the thought of Christian atheism is indeed central to this conversation. And I would suggest the conference that was recently had at Philosophy Portal. This will be broken down into parts. We'll focus quite a bit on Section 1 and the thought that Cadell presents there. I really like how he starts. He historically situates his analysis in his own life as a subject, and he also situates it in the New Age, the emergence of New Age atheism. And there are questions of what was its benefits, why did it happen? I think Cadell is correct to see New Age atheism as following from 9/11. But then, of course, why did it fail? Or why did it splinter off? Sam Harris went in a spiritualist direction, and then, of course, New Age atheism has arisen to the Jordan Peterson phenomenon, as Cadell rightly writes on and teaches on. And the question is, why? And what is missing from the movement at this point? And ultimately, you can see it as a kind of Christian atheism is missing, which is appropriate given that there's a new atheism that the four horsemen of the apocalypse, quote unquote, represent, and a certain return to Christianity in Peterson, at least in a mythological form, a map of meaning. And so it would be appropriate that we need to think the negation of the negation, I suppose, of the Christian atheism. And then I talked a bit about atheist Christianity as well. And I think it is also true that Zizek, in being the thinker of, his book, he wrote the book Christian Atheism, him being central to the conversation is important. And the including myself as a subject, that is also really important. The thought has to include you as a subject because you're a node of the historic process. And without reference to oneself in this way, not in this, crude self-reflection, but in this kind of deep historic situatedness and the negativity that follows, thought that is not so grounded, is likely just to contribute to what I like to call internally consistent systems, which I call a map, which, again, we can associate with Peterson. And I would argue that maps are not going to be our address today. They're trying to fill in the void left by the loss of givens. They feel like givens because they're internally consistent and therefore consist of no essential contradictions. But that just leads to something me and Lorenzo talked about on Pandora's rationality, this ever-splintering of internally consistent systems, fragmentations, which lend itself in duganistic and cheap delusion directions, of which I do not think are proper addresses for our moment. And also bringing in the subject is important because the subject is in whom the antinomies of reason, as Kant talks about, seem to arise. Contradiction, as Dr. Todd McGowan talks about, seems to arise with the subject. And Hegel suggests that far from the end of reason or outside of reason, the antinomies are where reason needs to, in a sense, begin or to tarry with, which then, if we're going to actually tarry with, will entail incorporating ourselves as a subject, because that is very difficult. It's one thing to talk about subjects that matter, and another thing to talk about them incorporating ourselves in the processes. Things become a whole lot more personal. And there's a way in which today is an age where thought that is not personal certainly can't contribute to the effort to extend the human versus the replacement of the human, as we face, given the thought of Nick Land, as Cadell also reflecting with Mikey in his new book, and his thinking on Nick Land and the logic of capital leading to AI, et cetera, if we don't think the personal, then we have already done to ourselves that which AI threatens to do to us, which is to leave the human behind, to leave the possibility of conviviality, as Ivan Illich might put it. Cadell writes, thus, what Enlightenment rationalists never sufficiently grapple with is the fact that the Enlightenment project itself, as an actual process, led directly into a confrontation with the real of madness at the core of our own psyches, perhaps properly recognized by the Freudian Lacanian lineage of psychoanalysis, as well as the world wars, as a brutal real that our civilization has still not learned how to process or internalize. So what I would call autonomous rationality, a project of the Enlightenment, which is sort of a notion that the self-consistency of rationality will lead to the best of all possible civilizations, or at least a better civilization. The problem is rationality functions by leaving behind madness, and ultimately you cannot do it. Madness will catch up. And when it catches up, you could say that rationality, out of the habit of dealing with madness, breaks. It can't handle it, and it has to suppress, repress, and this can look like a return to totalitarianism, which then eventually that madness, quote-unquote, or non-rationality, as I might put it, will eventually find some way to get out, and you can say today it's done that through Jordan Peterson. But then there are other forms of repression that arise there, and then the problems of thinking, the political, the sociological, and the economic, that if not thought, then the non-rational will nevertheless still be repressed because it will not be allowed into the habitus of the social order, as Dave has talked about. And Cadell writes on that point, as a result, we may still be dealing with structural problems that were identified by figures like Hegel and Marx, even if we find ourselves in a dramatically different historical context in terms of the modes of industrial production, artificial intelligence, for example, and international connectivity, say the global internet. Thus, the German idealist tradition, as well as the Marxist tradition, that is, the traditions that end Enlightenment, open up not a return to a higher positive supernatural entity, but a darkness or negativity internal to the reason of the human social body itself. Exactly. And I would associate that with non-rationality, as Bologna again talks about, without which we end up in game theory problems. So, what you have here is a realization that rationality does not take seriously, say, madness, the psyche, etc. It doesn't internalize that, which leads to all sorts of pathologies and trouble, as Cadell is putting it. And I would like to argue that not doing it leads to, Nash equilibria and various paradoxes in game theory. So it's, in a way, I see it as two sides of the same coin, right or wrong, which, funny enough, if that is the case with game theory, would basically suggest that rationality can't even really be rational in the sense of better without quote-unquote madness and or non-rationality. So the Enlightenment project cannot, in a way, even be itself unless it incorporates this madness and non-rationality. It ends up leading to quote-unquote suboptimal results. It leads to mediocrity. Cadell will talk about Sam Harris emerging in the New Age atheist movement, and that's kind of a start of a crack. And the Harris break, Cadell writes, the Harris break with conventional new atheism seems to emphasize and center the dimension of inner subjectivity on the level of meditative practice, psychedelic exploration, and the importance of reflection generally. He often points out that these dimensions are often neglected or perceived to be outside of reductive and scientific materialism. You could argue Harris is not wrong, but then, of course, if you really take that point seriously, it may lead to areas that Sam Harris doesn't realize it leads to. That he's broken, I suppose, with New Age atheism, unaware what that break entails, and where it will ultimately go, and what it must go to if it's not going to fall back onto problematic dynamics that historically have been troublesome. Let's say, for example, the psychedelic, there can be certainly a great experience, a great healing, a great opening that occurs in psychedelics. But a danger can be in that, precisely because it is so wonderful, it may weaken the incentive to do the tearing with the negativity or work needed for a social order to arise. Say, so much of the social, the symbolic in Lacan, depends on language. Well, the experience of the psychedelic, or say the mystical in religion, often feels as if language is inadequate, or that it fails, that there's a great failure in language. And yes, there is a great failure in language. But if you take that too seriously, or you could even say feel that too strongly, or too much center your practices around the reality of the ultimate failure of language, then simply the incentive or the drive to master or to tarry with language, perhaps not master language, but tarry with language, can go away. And this can contribute to a breakdown of the social. And critically, if there's a breakdown of the social, because that means that basically, capital wins, the logic of capital, AI, totalizing logics, which today are likely to look like utility, pragmatism, capital, A is A, etc., so forth. And if there is something fundamentally antagonistic about that kind of logic to human subjectivity, then this would be a crowding out of the human. So you really have to think what this direction Harris is going in leads to, and the same point can be made regarding Jordan Peterson. And I think Cadell's put his finger on that very, very strongly. And I think we can say that what Cadell writes here, while Harris represents the break from reason to spirit, so we're thinking Hegel's phenomenology of mind, of phenomenology of spirit, to resume, Peterson breaks from spirit to religion itself. We can understand Peterson most charitably if we see him as someone who is genuinely wrestling with religious mythological traditions, and specifically Christianity, in the context of a secular void. And I think that's really well put. We can locate Harris, reason to spirit, Peterson, spirit to religion, which opens up the question of religion to absolute knowing. I should also read this wonderful line. We might start to entertain the post-Enlightenment idea of the German idealists, that Enlightenment reason reaches the limits of its own imaginary totalizations on the level of the real of historic subjectivity and the real of the world historical human conflict. The real of world historical human conflict is extremely important, because ultimately everything has to come to that. And the question is, does Harris and Peterson bring us to that? And if not, why not? And what are the benefits of them nevertheless, but what are also the negatives? And I think we can also, there's a kind of a tradition I would associate it with Dante, but I admittedly associate much with Dante, is with the idea that the higher one climbs, the greater the fall if one goes backwards. And one could say that is precisely because Harris, Dawkins, Harris, and Peterson are suggesting ways forward. If there is a regression or if the journey is not completed, then there can be a fallback, which would have been that is worse than had the journey never gone on at all. There's an idea that only Lucifer can become Satan, because only the highest angel can fall that far, right? And that might be the stakes of what's going on here. If we do not see through, see to the end what is being introduced in these thinkers, then we might end up worse off. And that's ultimately going to lead to the real of the historic moment, the world historical human conflict. And Cadell will point out that Zizek seems to be located on that question, and I agree that he is. And so the idea that you can say that perhaps the mistake of new atheists, I keep saying new age, forgive me, new atheists. In other words, the entire logical game set up by the new atheists, that of debating the logical propositions of evolutionary science and theology, obfuscates the dimension of unconscious action where we may find out what a society actually believes without knowing it. This is extremely important. So what is being suggested is that the new atheists located people's beliefs in their conscious propositions and what they could defend. And Peterson is kind of suggesting, no, the unconscious action is more important. In the myths of, say, Christianity, Judaism, etc., somehow provided an address to this unconsciousness that getting rid of them doesn't address, and if you don't address this unconscious, it's going to burst onto the scene and lead to all sorts of unintentional consequences. I completely agree. And there's a way in which what Peterson is saying about myths makes me think of Givens and belonging again, but I would make a critical distinction, and this is where I would critique Peterson, is that myths without Givens do not have the same sociological grounding. Dealing with the unconscious is dealt with mostly through a certain thoughtlessness, as Hannah Arendt has put it. You just operate without thinking about it, and it's certainly something repressive about it. I don't disagree, but the myths have to work in a certain conscious with the givens, where you have just enough release and questioning of the givens that there is a way in which you can move out of thoughtlessness, but not too much too quickly. But the myths are not just straight-up propositions, because if they were, they would question the givens too strongly, too quickly, and reason would just deconstruct them. Because reason can always deconstruct givens, because they're given. They're not rationally justified. They're accepted. They're absorbed. They're part of the horizon, if you will. We talked at the net the other night, 151, on the difference, just tentative language, the difference between persuasion and deliberation. Deliberation is where you say, there is the beautiful, now what is it? So you agree on a first principle or a value, and then you debate what it is. Whereas persuasion is, I'm going to persuade you beauty exists. You could argue, the problem is on highest principles, or these kind of more abstract principles, you can never persuade people to them. There can always be room for doubt. You can always question them, right? So, and you almost see in Socrates deliberation more than persuasion, but we'd have to go into detail on this. And it's more of the philosophical posture, if it's not going to just eat itself, often, or the religious postures, is often more, we believe God exists, now what is God? It's like Augustine saying, who is it, what is it that I love when I say that I love God? There's this questioning of a given, right? So givens are deliberated. They can't be persuaded to, because there's always reason not to accept them. And myths work with the givens to allow space for the deliberation that is not so straightforward that it slips into an autonomous reason that deconstructs it. And the mythological story can always be returned to. A proposition like 2 + 2 = 4, you don't really gain anything new out of the return to the proposition, or many propositions. Whereas a myth, you can hear the story of the prodigal son, my goodness, how many times do people find new takes on the fall, Adam and Eve? It's extraordinary, right? So there's an infinite sort of space of deliberation in these myths that moves the given into conscious consideration, but not so much that you're forced to face the unconscious so quickly and all at once that it overwhelms you. So myths are a very interesting technology for working in cooperation with givens to help them work on the human subject. But the question is, can myths so function without givens? If you don't believe in God, it's just the mythological story, right? You could argue that Peterson is sort of occupying that space, right? And there's a way in which Peterson is working to have the myths do the whole of the work of givenness for the human psyche. And I question this because in a sense, yes, it can work for individuals, but in regard to a universal social collective, it will not so work and will easily just fragment into Pandora's rationality, because people's myths could be a conspiracy theory. Their myth could be a political ideology. Why should people pick myth X versus Y? Okay, Peterson, I need a myth. Sure, I need a map. But why a map? Why a map that other people can share in? So you have this problem of the many and the one that emerges. And every political, this is a huge claim, but I would argue that every political ideology has something to do with the question of the many and the one. And ultimately, a political ideology that emerges from a kind of a strong basis in myth, in maps, is not going to be able to, is a decentralization effort. Now, you can offer like states' rights, federalism. There's something very, very much the segregation, civil war. There's something very desegregational about it. It's a decentralization. And you can argue decentralization is better than centralization, absolutely. But it would not be an address from that pendulum of history that swings between centralization and decentralization, that just goes back and forth. I don't think it is the new address that we need. I think it's just a form of an old address in a new framing. And again, you may argue that it is better, what Peterson is, you can easily argue that what Peterson is putting on offer is better than what is currently available. Absolutely. That's perfectly fine. But in regard, and it's easily a step, like Cadell has pointed out, from, say, spirit to religion. But can it take us to absolute knowing? I don't think so. Now, that doesn't mean Peterson isn't doing that work to get us. I think this starts to lead us into things like beauty, the apophatic, et cetera, so forth. I've talked about alterology, these other topics. But if simply in a internally consistent system is not necessarily going to deal with the problem of the social in the universal. It easily can help an individual deal with the unconscious. It can easily help an individual have a better life. But can it move to dealing with the problem of the social and the symbolic and bringing things into language? I'm not so sure. And in that way, Peterson and a certain cheap delusionism can go together. They can end up quite similar. And the question of the social is major here. That's really what we have to think. And also, I think Cadell is right when he writes this. Ultimately, what ends up happening is Peterson's thinking, just like, say, new atheism, basically does not address the logic of capital, which ultimately will prevail over all of this. It will ultimately be left untouched, and so it will prove the victor. To read from the book, this is Cadell, and we've already talked about how in Hegel, the rational anomalies, the contradictions, are not bracketed out, but something which thinking is forced to face. And you could also argue, before I forget, the only way for thinking really, really to face contradiction, it has to be embodied. Because whatever idea thought has about facing contradiction will be integrated into the consistency of thought. It will become rational then to face contradiction, which will then make contradiction a word that doesn't mean what it seems. There is, if we take seriously the idea that thinking has to dwell or deal with the enemies, these contradictions, then that right there suggests that thought has to be embodied. Because if thought is left to its own devices, or has only its own devices by which to face said contradictions, it will probably be engaged in self-deception. It will probably be engaged in self-delusion. But anyway, to read from the book. Moreover, we tarry with these rational antinomies, not to remain in such oppositions eternally, but to derive from the antinomy a new positive result that would not have been possible otherwise. In Peterson's thinking, which tends toward a mythological regression, there is a tendency to avoid such dialectics for a one-sided positionality. Capitalism over communism, traditional Christian culture over woke, politically correct culture. In the real, we might say there is an antagonistic unity in both dualities that points toward a higher order necessity. And this higher order necessity is extremely important. And again, looking at Hegel, if we're always just one-sided, talking about one side versus the other, and we don't really understand that everything that seems to be one-sided passes over into otherness, entails its otherness, which is such an emphasis in Hegel. Kołobowski would say it's a situation. There are no stable states. There's no algebra, only geometry, process, relation, etc., so forth. That it's always going to pass over into otherness. Then any sort of thinking that is going to emphasize a one-sided capitalism over communism is probably going to be repressive. There's going to be something it represses to make that one-sidedness seem as an address, to seem fitting, to seem right. And so that's a major problem. So we have to see the truth. The truth is in the whole, as Hegel says. But the whole is not one-sided. But you can't think the whole all at once. And if we can't do this, we're going to just, evidence we're not doing this is the social apocalypse we're facing. There seems to be a social apocalypse going on. Cadell will then bring in Zizek as this point of entering real speculations, where we've had the passing over from new atheism to Peterson. There's a passing of otherness, A to B, but now B to A. And that's going to be the opening of real speculation, which entails Zizek. But again, what's very important is that if we don't go through the death of God on the cross, Jesus, there's going to be a neurotic structure, and there's going to be some big other lurking in our political thinking. We have to pass through subjective destitution. And you could argue that it is only through subjective destitution that we can handle the tension of moving from one-sidedness. I mean, when you start as an example, if you grow up in a relatively conservative area, Christian or whatever, and you start really thinking about liberalism, atheism, really taking them seriously and thinking about them, that will probably result in alienation or rejection from the people around you. And that can be very difficult. And if you're not ready for that, you're probably going to fall back onto the one-sidedness you were born into. It's just going to be very natural. So if you're actually going to be able to hold bothness long enough, ergo to maintain the patience of the subject, then that's going to require this subjective destitution. It's going to require giving up any holding to, say, the possibility of a final solution. Well, a final address, you could say, in the sense of a stable state. And one of the reasons why giving that up or, letting go of that is so important is because if that's even a possibility in your thinking, the temptation to start projecting that somehow into your one-sidedness, into the one-sidedness you were born into, or that the people around you like, will simply be too great. There has to just be an acceptance that that option is not on the table, and that is one then opens up the Holy Spirit. Like if you really, really believe that and take it seriously and dwell with the negativity, then you can become one through which network subjectivity, Holy Spirit, can work through, operate with, and spread, per se. And I think that's very important. And we also need to see this necessity as historically situated, a historically situated necessity. And we can think of it in line with what Cadell writes here. Here, Zizek's work often functions as the opposite of the Fukuyama consensus, suggesting an end of history, that is, the decline of the neoliberal form in the face of impossible commons problems, as opposed to its universalization. So the problem of the commons is what can break down Fukuyama. The fact, and I would associate that with the problem of themos, that Fukuyama himself seems to acknowledge that capital does not fully address, and through Logos and Eros, and Owen in the Agon talks about this, has attempted to deal or numb themos, social recognition, abilities of recognition, release, etc. Well, if that is not addressed, then it's going to break through and lead to a return to strong men or problematic political ideologies, violence, whatever. And so we really need to think what Zizek is saying before the Fukuyama consensus breaks down, because there's good in the Fukuyama, in the neoliberal. There's a very important good, but that will not be brought out. It has to be sublated. That good has to be negated and sublated, and that's going to require what Zizek is bringing to the table. We have to, Jamerson is famous for saying that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And if that applies to us, if that continues to be the case, then the negation sublation of neoliberalism is basically impossible. Perhaps real speculation is the thinking of the end of capitalism, not just the end of the world, where, it's not really real speculation to think of the end of the world now, which is kind of funny because the real is this sort of shattering reality. It's kind of funny now that the end of the world is not a shattering reality. I suppose we've seen too many movies about it, but the end of capitalism, that's very difficult to think and would require real speculation. Notably, if the end of capitalism requires a commons in which the negativity of subjectivity must be tarried with. And the end of capitalism, we don't have to see that necessarily as the destruction of capitalism. The end could be the purpose, the end. What is it leading toward? Like Neil Postman plays on that with his book, The End of Education, in a similar way, that the end of capitalism can be the realization of whatever good is in its core, whatever good value, actual value, is there. But that's going to be very difficult. But it can be done. It just requires real speculation. And Cadell will note that Zizek's most recent work on Christian atheism ultimately holds a potential resolution to the history of Western belief, as well as its capacity to affirm a scientific and rational future in truth. And I think Cadell will make the case for why that is so as he goes forward in his book. We have now covered the introduction, dialecticizing new atheism. We will move to be thinking thought foundations, global mind next. For more by Cadell Last, please visit philosophyportal.org. You can find the book on Amazon, Real Speculations, Thought Foundations, Drive Myths, Social Analysis. And thank you so much for your time.